Right, hi everybody, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to cover the topic of fisheries and aquaculture, which is part of topic 4.3, aquatic food production systems. I've already said in a previous video, which I called demand for aquatic food resources, I was going to split this into two sections. So in the previous one that I just mentioned, I covered the demand for aquatic resources, what we actually harvest. And in this one, I'm going to cover the methods of how we actually harvest those resources. And we do that harvesting in two ways. Either through exploiting fisheries, you go out on your fishing boat and you fish, or through aquaculture, where you raise aquatic organisms in captivity for harvesting. So before you watch this video, I should say this is the sequel, and you should go back and watch my previous video, Demand for Aquatic Food Resources, first, if you hadn't. When I was planning this, I wasn't sure what to put in the my box of key concepts or keywords above my head. So in the end, I decided to put something that's not specifically in the syllabus, but it kind of links everything together that I'm going to talk about today. It's this video. You might recognize it. It's just an ecological pyramid, possibly energy or biomass, and it shows the trophic levels, going from the bottom trophic level to the top. Now, when we harvest terrestrial resources, terrestrial foods, we generally harvest the bottom trophic levels, the plants, up to and including the second trophic level, the grazing animals like cows. However, when we exploit aquatic resources, we're generally taking not from the bottom of the food chain, but from close to the top. So shellfish, like scallops, mollusks, the like, that's the second trophic level. Here we've got herrings, third trophic level. Salmon, very close to the top of the food chain, the fourth trophic level. And when you buy tuna, you're actually taking fish from the fifth trophic level, the top trophic level. That's not much of an issue when you're going out on your fishing boat and you're harvesting natural fisheries. But if you're interested in farming these animals, then it's worth noting that the laws of thermodynamics tell us we need to put an awful lot of energy in to be able to farm animals close to the top of the food chain. So therefore, it takes a lot more energy, effort, and food to farm salmon, a kilogram of salmon, than it would to farm a kilogram of beef. Obviously, there's other environmental issues involved with farming beef, and we'll talk about that elsewhere. But I just thought it was worth mentioning that and bearing that in mind as we go through this section. Okay, so before I move on, it's worth mentioning just exactly what fisheries and aquaculture are. A fishery is a natural stock, not just of fish, of aquatic resources in the wild. And aquaculture is where we farm aquatic resources for harvesting, either in aquatic pens in estuaries or on coastlines, or actually on land. Aquaculture can take place on land as well. And it's also worth mentioning that fish farming has become synonymous with aquaculture, but there are a lot of different types of aquaculture. So seaweeds are farmed, crustaceans like shrimps, prawns, crayfish, crabs, mollusks like clams, mussels and oysters, and those species can either be freshwater or seawater species. It's actually a very diverse industry, and it's actually become a huge industry, growing all the time. Okay, so let me begin by going to the syllabus. All I've done here is pasted in everything that I didn't cover in the previous video, which means this has left me quite a lot to cover in this one, so I hope I don't, as usual, rumble on too long. So these are the things we need to cover. Just worth bearing in mind that this is just basically material that I want to cover in terms of knowledge. The applications in terms of evaluations and comparing and contrasting these things, we'll do that in the class. So I just want to present the knowledge base in this video. Okay, in terms of knowledge and understanding, developments in fishing equipment and changes to fishing methods have led to dwindling fish stocks and damage to habitats. It's becoming easier and easier for fishing fleets to harvest up every last fish at the moment through the use of sonar and other equipment. Unsustainable exploitation of aquatic systems can be mitigated at a variety of levels through policy, legislation, and changes in consumer behaviour. So we need to talk about how we can make fishing and aquaculture a sustainable industry. Then it says aquaculture has grown to provide additional food resources and support economic development and will continue to rise. That's just a statement of fact that I've already mentioned, actually. Issues around aquaculture, or the problems of aquaculture, include loss of habitat, pollution with various things, the spread of disease, and escaped species. I'll cover that very specifically in a case study at the end of this video. And then in terms of applications, we'll touch on these things. The IB says we need to discuss, with reference to a case study, the controversial harvesting of a named species. I actually want to give you two case studies based on Atlantic cod fisheries there. Then it says evaluate strategies that can be used to avoid unsustainable fishing. We'll talk about how we can make the fishing industry more sustainable. Explain the potential value of aquaculture, providing food for future generations. I might leave that to the classroom, really. Again, it's just a statement of fact more than anything that we need to discuss in a bit of context. And then finally, discuss a case study that demonstrates the impact of aquaculture. Okay, so I want to base that section on three different case studies that I'll talk about in a little bit of detail. Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about fisheries first of all. When you exploit a fishery, what you need to do is harvest at something called a maximum sustainable yield. It means you're taking fish at the point of maximum rate of growth. If you fish higher than that, you're taking too many fish and you're risking collapse of the fish stock. And below that, you're taking less fish than you can actually fish sustainably. So that wouldn't make too much sense. Unfortunately, there's two reasons why, certainly in the past and going into the future, human beings have not fished at the maximum sustainable yield of pretty much any fishery in the world. Now, I've said there's two reasons here, and they're pretty much two sides of the same coin. One is the idea of short-term gain. It's very easy to take much more than your quota of fish, either as an individual fisherman or as a country, if you can see short-term gain on the immediate horizon. And secondly, it's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. Now, we'll cover this in some detail elsewhere, and I will put a link to another YouTube clip here above my head. But very, very briefly, the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy, the word tragedy in its kind of Greek tragedy and Shakespearean tragedy sense is the inescapable arrival of a terrible fate due to the problems that are inbuilt into human beings. And that's the case here. It was originally introduced as a study of economics. And basically it boils down to the fact that if you have a choice of exploiting and getting small short-term gain for yourself, or you've got the choice of exploiting sustainably, you'll take the former option. It's in human nature to take the short-term gain because of the fear that if you don't, somebody else will do the same. It's inescapable. So therefore, pretty much every fishery in the world has been overexploited due to this problem of the tragedy of the commons. I've probably not made a very good attempt at explaining that, but I will certainly go through that in future videos, and especially when we look at topic 2. Okay, I'm going to introduce you to two case studies here. both with the same fish species, the cod. Now, growing up in England myself in the 70s and 80s, cod was pretty much part of the staple diet. I wouldn't say we had fish and chips every day, but it was close to it. In terms of Newfoundland cod, this is obviously in Canada, northern Canada, also called the Grand Banks fishery. In the 1950s, it was pretty much the largest cod stock known in the world. It was very easy to fish, and therefore a huge industry grew up in Canada, in Newfoundland, to exploit it. So throughout the 1930s, 40s and 50s, it was pretty much sustainably fished. But in the late 50s and early 60s, there was a huge explosion in the size of the fishing fleet and the fishing gear and the fishing technology available to exploit that fishery. And the exploitation of that fishery exploded. It peaked in 1968, where about 800,000 tonnes of Newfoundland cod were fished in a single season. And then straight after that, it became obvious to the Canadians that the fishery was collapsing. Even then, local and national government did very little, because by then the fishing industry in the area had become so huge and employed so many thousands of people that no government was willing to put those jobs at risk. And again, the tragedy was that the whole stock collapsed. There were attempts in the 70s and 80s to try to exploit it sustainably, but in the early 90s, late 80s, the stock collapsed completely, pretty much overnight. And then the government had no choice, because there was no fish left, or very few fish left. They had to close the fishing industry. And in 1992, about 42,000 jobs were lost overnight, and the fishery never recovered. It was just a case of, very simply, just exploiting the fishery for many years above its maximum sustainable yield. Okay, a second case study, possibly more violent, but with potentially a more rosy outlook or a more rosy outcome, was the Cod Wars. So these were a series of wars or skirmishes that were fought between the British and the Icelandics between the 1950s and the 1970s. They've become known as the Cod Wars. There were basically three skirmishes, or three Cod Wars. It started in 1952 when the Icelandic government realised, after the North Atlantic herring stock had collapsed, that they really needed to do something to protect the cod. It was the biggest, and still is, I think, the biggest industry in Iceland, one of the biggest employers. There were signs that it was in trouble in the 1950s. So what the Icelanders did was they extended the fishing grounds from 3 miles off the Iceland coast to 4 miles. At that time, Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain, and after a lot of grumbling, he basically accepted what had happened. It didn't really affect the British fishing fleet at the time. Carried on, and in 1958, Iceland announced that it was going to expand its fishing waters, further, and they expanded it to 12 nautical miles off the Icelandic coast. That's really still quite a small percentage of this. It's called the UK gap between Scotland and Iceland. The British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Macmillan, responded by sending the Royal Navy to police the British fishing fleet in the North Atlantic. And there were some skirmishes then between Icelandic gunboats, which were basically just converted fishing boats, and the British Navy. And then in 1972, Iceland decided it wanted to protect its own fish stocks even more. They expanded that to 50 nautical miles off the coast, which really started to infuriate the British fishing fleet. They started to come into contact with more and more Icelandic gunboats, which basically were just going around cutting the nets. And then finally, in 1975, they expanded it further to 200 miles. The outcome was that, British ships and Icelandic ships nearly came to blows. They started to ram each other. And eventually, Iceland won. The final straw was when, because it was still during the Cold War, the United States had and still have a Air Force base in Iceland, in Keflavik, and they wanted to protect NATO during the Cold War, and basically the United States told Britain that they wouldn't support any attempt to challenge Icelandic fisheries. So therefore Britain had to accept it. The fishing industry in the north of England especially just disappeared overnight. And that was the end of pretty much the North Atlantic fishing from the north of England. In some ways it's a sad story because it went back generations of fishermen. But the outcome was, I think, that the cod stocks were pretty much protected from that point onwards, through the 80s and onwards. If left to their own devices, the British would have just completely overexploited the North Atlantic cod stocks and they would have collapsed anyway. So in many ways, it was a good outcome. Okay. Okay, you can see the details there. Okay, then I can come back to what it says in the syllabus about talking about sustainable fisheries. This is just a list of possible strategies that we could talk about in the class. Most of them are pretty obvious. So number one, fishing fleets could be reduced. Number two, the size of individual fishing boats can be reduced, and net sizes or mesh sizes can be reduced as well. The idea of that net size specifically is that it's very important to catch mature fish but allow young fish to escape so that they can go on and spawn and produce the next generation. You could introduce closed seasons where there's no marine hunting or marine fishing. The idea of exclusion zones or protected areas. This goes back to the case study of the cod wars with Iceland. Allowing not fishing in spawning areas so the fish can actually spawn and reproduce. And then one other thing that can be introduced is to encourage consumers to buy responsibly. This doesn't seem to exist in Mexico where I am at the moment, but there's an organisation called the Marine Stewardship Council, or the MSC. It was set up in Britain in the 90s, I believe, and they basically put this blue tick mark on fish that they recognise as coming from sustainable sources or sustainable fisheries. So I don't generally buy fish. But if you do, it's worth looking out for the blue tick sign to check that the fish you're buying actually comes from a sustainable stock. The MSC is quite a reputable organisation, and it seems to do its job well in identifying sustainable fisheries. Okay, and then we'll come to the last part. I'll leave fisheries behind and talk about aquaculture. So I've said aquaculture is the farming of aquatic species, not just fish, but largely fish species. Not just food, but also for, well, I didn't mention this before, skins. Fish for pets is another example, seaweeds. Aquaculture is increasing as fisheries decline. There seems to be a switch going on at the moment from going out to sea to fish to actually being able to make more money by farming fish, especially in fish farms. There are open and closed systems. Open systems, you can farm fish. Well, if we're talking about fish farms, you can farm them in pens that can be put into estuaries. or the coastline, although generally the coastline needs to be sheltered to avoid damage from waves and storms. But you can also put tanks on land and farm animals on land. The three species that are farmed more than anything else, I believe, are carp, which is the biggest farmed fish species, salmon, and catfish. Catfish, especially in the US. Okay. Okay, the problems or the environmental impacts of aquaculture. First of all, we could talk about if you're going to set up fish farms, it could lead to loss of habitats. For example, mangroves can be torn up to create closed systems. Sediments are created from fish poo, fish feces, which can smother the ocean bed and therefore destroy the habitats of other species on the seabed or the estuarine bed. Nutrients produced by fish poo can create eutrophic conditions and algal blooms, which I talked a little bit about in the previous video. A very big problem is the additives that are put into fish farming pens. They include antibiotics and hormones. When you're farming animals in such close contact, it can lead to big outbreaks of disease, which is density dependent. So therefore, fish farmers try to control that by putting antibiotics and hormones into the fish by injection or into the water, which can lead to problems if they're water soluble of spread into the local environment. Hormones are used to encourage muscle growth in fish, especially to try and get more meat for each fish that you produce. In order to stop fouling, things like barnacles or other pests starting to grow on pens and things, they're very often painted with anti-fouling paints to stop that growth, and they can include heavy metals, which can be very polluting, you know that. Another problem with heavy metals is build up through the food chain due to biomagnification. Spread of disease I've already mentioned. And then a big problem is potential escape of farmed animals, which may not in many cases actually be indigenous species. And we've already talked about how the accidental introduction of alien species can be a huge problem, especially in pristine environments. You can attract predators, which come to prey on the species you're farming. And also, if you're farming something like salmon, I've already mentioned, because they're close to the top of the food chain here, the food that they eat has to come from somewhere. You might be farming salmon fairly sustainably, but the food that you're feeding them might be fish meal that comes from unsustainable fisheries. So it's an example of maybe shifting the problem from one point to another point. Okay, it's not all bad news. Here are some positive effects of aquaculture, again, specifically fish farming. You can farm very large numbers of individuals in a fairly small area, or volume, possibly. It's an answer towards the increasing global demand for fish. It's got to come from somewhere. A good source of local employment. You can build your fish farm locally and therefore cut down on the huge costs and huge environmental damage of transporting these aquatic resources across the globe. The knock-on effect of reducing pressure on fisheries, sea fisheries, reducing the necessity of fishing fleets. It could enable fish stocks to recover, to be exploited again in the future. A big problem with traditional fisheries is bycatch. So generally, if you're trawling for fish, which means you just have a huge seine net at the back of your fishing boat, obviously it's impossible just to catch the fish or the fish species you're interested in. There's a huge bycatch, which in many cases might just be thrown back dead back into the sea. And it reduces the dependence of a lot of countries on importation of their own food. which might be especially important for LEDCs or newly industrialized countries. Okay, and then final slide. I hope I've not gone on too long at the moment. The syllabus asks for a case study specifically about aquaculture, and I wanted to talk about this fairly specific case study. In the picture, you can see the Punta Redonda salmon farm, which is in southern Chile. You can see it on this map here. This is where it's located. Towards the south of Chile, it's in a kind of inlet that's surrounded by these islands, as I said, to try to protect against the damage from waves or storms. And at its peak, it holds about, well, close to 1 million Atlantic salmon. It's owned by a huge multinational fish farming company called Marine Harvest, which I believe has recently renamed itself Maui. And it faced a lot of problems in the past for disease outbreaks within its fish, specifically a disease called ISA, which is, I believe, infectious salmon anemia, which is like a fish flu, very, very infectious, not to humans, but to salmon and other fish species. You can see it's an open system, so the fish are in these huge pens. I don't think this really does justice to how big the fish farm is. This is a reasonably sized boat here, which you can just about see. And obviously it contained, at its peak, about 1 million fish. So these are huge pens. The reason I'm talking about this case study was because in July 2019, last year, there was a massive escape of fish from this fish farm. There was a storm that went on for a few days. The staff were unable to get to the pens to protect them, and pretty much all of the fish escaped. Only about 250,000 fish were recaptured, which meant that 600,000 fish or so swam away. Now, some points to bear in mind about this. First of all, the fish that escaped were dosed with high doses of antibiotics. They weren't ready for harvesting at that point. They were possibly carrying diseases, like I just mentioned, ISA, and possibly other parasites like lice, which could go on to infect local fish populations. This is a a fairly pristine environment. And remember, these are Atlantic salmon. They're not indigenous to this region of Chile. Salmon are quite voracious predators. And to introduce a predator to a new, fairly pristine environment like that is potentially disastrous. NGOs like Greenpeace have really criticised Maui, or Marine Harvest, and one of the problems that I've read about is the idea that as long as it's a huge developing industry with obviously huge amounts of money involved, and one of the criticisms was that there's no incentive for them to really look after these environments, because they can just pass on all of these problems to the insurers. And as long as insurers are prepared to insure these fish farms, there's not a big incentive for these big companies to really prevent accidents like this happening. Okay, so that was one fairly specific case study that's worth mentioning. All right, I think I've done as much as I want to talk about in this video. I know I've jumped around an awful lot. It's probably not the most organised of talks, but I think I've covered most of the content that I want to talk about, and we'll go into details about comparing and contrasting, discussing those kind of essay subjects in the classroom based on this content. Okay, so take care everybody as usual, take care of yourselves and your family, and I will speak to you in our class this week. Okay, bye bye.